Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Okay. Hello, hello. So, apologies for the little bit of technical issues here in our final part of the lesson. But we will carry on just to finish this element here of the lesson. And to do so, we'll just finish up our last kind of thoughts because we are getting towards the end of our lesson anyway. So let's bring it back to Othello and Filth and Dirt. So here we have, as we said, Othello has this whiter skin of hers. We have ideas of light linked to her as if he's trying to see the truth. Here as well, 'twas he that first told me on her first. An honest man he is and hates the slime that sticks on filthy deeds. So we have this idea then of dirt contaminating Desdemona, and this dirt being her bad reputation, these sins that she's committed, and Iago who has told him this. So he bases all of this on only Iago's description. And immediately says, "O gull, O dolt, O ignorant as dirt, she was too fond of her most filthy bargain," too fond of you. And she uses a very racist description of this in order to do that. Apologies, team. Okay, so ignorant as dirt, most filthy bargain. We have these ideas then of dirt not just associated with Desdemona, but also in the eyes of Emilia and the other Venetians with Othello. Not only his racism, but also his villainy in Emilia's eyes. But we can see then that this view is cyclical. As Neil says, culturally embedded notions of adulteration and pollution that are closely linked with the ideas of disproportion and monstrosity exploited by Iago. So we have this idea of dirtiness that Iago creates and pulls out that was sort of reflective of views of the time. He also says in the 17th century, adultery was conceived, as the history of the two words remind us, to be quite literally a kind of adulteration, a pollution or corruption of the divinely ordained bond of marriage, and thus in the profoundest sense a violation of the natural order of things. It's this idea then of this linked with adultery. Neil as well, in the Elizabethan popular imagination, of course, the association of African races with monsters supposed to inhabit their continent made it easy for blackness to be imagined as a symptom of the monstrous, not least because the colour itself could be derived from an adulterous history. So this idea then, of course, of monstrosity and blackness here in the Jacobean zeitgeist, thus leaking into their ideas of purity and evil. And Neil, tragedy is always black-faced, but Othello's dark countenance is more like an inscription of his tragic destiny for more reasons than the traditional metaphoric associations of blackness with evil and death. So this idea then, Othello's blackness, his contamination of Desdemona, marks out his tragic destiny as he is in Venice. Neil talks about the violated marriage bed as part of this as well. As Othello says, strangle in her bed, even the bed she hath contaminated, thy bed lust-stained shall with lust's blood be spotted. So this idea of stained and contamination being linked specifically to the marriage bed, and this appearance of adultery being much more important than the reality of the adultery, which we of course know is not true. Newman says Othello is tainting the blood and society of Venice. Iago's emotive fear of miscegenation. So here then we're thinking of Desdemona as having been corrupted here. Neil also says that it became the practice for 19th century Othellos to screen the murder from the audience by closing the curtains upon the bed. This idea of an unseeable horror. So specifically then, this idea of what cannot be seen on a Jacobean stage, this idea of it's unseeable, so appearance versus reality, we can't even see it. Like King Duncan in Macbeth, we cannot view something so unspeakably horrific to the Jacobean audience. He also says the bed was so intensely identified with the anxieties about race and sex stirred up by the play that it needed, as far as possible, to be removed from the public gaze. So here we're really thinking about the audience's appearance versus reality as well. We don't see the consummation of the marriage, of course, but we also don't see a lot of interaction between Desdemona and Othello here. And we don't see a lot of what we would need to see to be comfortable condemning Desdemona as well. So Shakespeare here, as well as Iago, is playing with sight. Neil says the opening stage direction, enter Desdemona in her bed. This is in particularly Act 5, Scene 2. Announces ocular proof to all that the audiences have most desired and feared to look upon, exposing to cruel light the obscure erotic fantasies that the play both explores and disturbingly excites in its audience. So this idea then of Shakespeare being aware of and bringing to light, as we saw in our previous lesson, this idea of fear and anxieties around sex and marriage, particularly between these two characters, but as well this idea of this being enough confirmation for a Jacobean audience that they need to be condemned. This sort of willingness to go to bed with Othello is enough to condemn Desdemona to the Jacobean mindset. Matthew saying all that Iago's poison has achieved is an object that poisons sight. Such an interesting idea there, to think of this as literally affecting sight. A bed on which a black man and a white girl, although they are dead, are embracing. So this idea then here of the poison sight not only of Othello, but also of the Jacobean audience. So Shakespeare revealing the prejudices here, his audience. We also are destabilized ourselves in the setting of the play. By setting, I include time as well as place here. Because this is the theory of double time that started to appear in 1849-1850 by Christopher North, which is a pseudonym for John Wilson. The action takes place in just 2 days, or rather 2 nights. Fittingly, most of the action of the play occurs at night. Iago works best in the dark. Interesting. Iago associated with dark then, with the lack of sight. But how can so much happen in such a short time? The theory of double time was developed in 1849 to 1850 by Christopher North to explain the discrepancies. The main action is set over just 2 days because that is what makes the play so dramatically effective. But at the same time, Shakespeare makes us think the time is actually longer, long enough for the adultery to be possible. So here then, not only is Shakespeare playing with Othello's view and sight, Iago's view, Cassio, Desdemona's view, but also with our view, because we are disturbed by reality here. We don't know what's true. When is it day? When is it night? How long have they had together? Are they ever together biblically in this play at all? Is there some sort of almost supernatural sort of collapsing time idea here that means that we are even further destabilized because we don't have a solid grasp on reality ourselves? And then our arguments here. So rather than writing them out, I'll just speak about some of the arguments that we've come up with here. So firstly, Othello's overly swift willingness to believe appearances rather than reality makes him the architect of his own downfall. So this idea that Othello giving into appearances without actually checking about reality, his naivete, his capitulation to appearances, is actually his fault. As well, this idea of Iago intentionally blurring the lines between appearance and reality and serves as a director of the action of the play. We can think of Othello's jealousy and fear as driving him towards his own destruction, as he is unable to see reality as a result of his jealousy and fear. We can say that this handkerchief is the fixation of the play, and we are drawn to it as the ocular proof that confirms Othello's doubts and is used by Iago to construct reality. We could have this idea of jealousy as this green-eyed monster, and really borrow a paragraph from jealousy as something that is blinding for Othello. We can have this idea of dirt and corruption here as contaminating reality, as covering and changing and altering reality. We can have the trajectory of Othello, or perhaps the fact that Othello doesn't seem to see Desdemona as a person throughout. So borrowing again from ideas from other essays and other themes that we've looked at, to say, well, he idealizes her, so we can't see her really. And then as soon as she is not what he thinks she is, she falls off this pedestal and is distracted. We can do a whole paragraph on the blurring of light and darkness here. Even a paragraph on Othello being associated with darkness, Desdemona being associated with light. There's so much richness here, even in thinking about the audience's own appearance versus reality, and how Iago's role is not only to disturb Othello, but also to disturb us. Apologies again for the technological issues that led to a little bit of a disruption in this lesson. Thank you so much for continuing to join in this presentation of Othello's from Shakespeare and the theme appearance versus reality. We'll see you on Friday for our next lesson. Bye for now.